the regulations or the legislation to make sure that we have the safest workplaces we possibly can are the best set of regulations or legislation to make that happen. In no way has the government ever said that we did not want to have the strongest possible provisions in place to make women, or anybody for that matter, feel safe at work and be safe at work.
The Prime Minister says there should be no politics involved in this plan. So why has the government not supported recommendations such as paid domestic violence leave, giving women, largely women, the right to take that leave if they are suffering violence? And we know so many are.
Well, we, at the recommendation of the Fair Work Commission, we put in place a couple of years ago a 1 week of unpaid domestic violence leave at their recommendation. Currently, the Fair Work Commission is actually looking at reviewing whether this is actually the appropriate level of support for women in domestic violence situations, and we obviously will wait with great interest with their recommendations. But in the meantime, as part of the budget, the 2021 budget and the $1.1 billion that we committed to investing in women's safety, we put in place an escaping violence package which supports all women, not just women who are working, but every woman who is escaping domestic violence will have access to the escaping violence payment, which is a $5,000 payment that is provided to her to support her when she makes that extraordinarily difficult and brave decision to actually leave a violent relationship.
Your colleague, the Minister for Women's Economic Security, Jane Hume, told me yesterday on the program that work is still underway on a number of the other recommendations, as you mentioned. Can you give me a sort of sense of what the time frame is here? As I say, I think there is a sense of urgency around these recommendations. What can you commit to? Will you be making sure that you deal with the others that you still need to do work on within 6 months, for instance?
Well, I certainly know that Michaela Cash is working as quickly as she can whilst making sure that she does appropriate consultation. Obviously, we're working with the states and territories and with the business sector and the business sector representatives to make sure that we are, acting with haste to put these recommendations in place. But, this summit that we've just had also gives us an opportunity to hear from people who are impacted in the area of family, domestic and sexual violence so that we can put in place the things that they have told us that they think are important to change the dial in this particular area. So this is something that we are all absolutely committed to. And I think that the comments from the Prime Minister yesterday really highlighted how high a priority this issue of family, domestic and sexual violence, as well as in the workplace, in the community and at home, is to this government.
Can you give me a sense of what a time frame is that links to the word haste?
Well, in the relation to the next national plan to end violence against women and their children, the current plan is due to finish at the end of June 2022, and so we will be working to ensure that the next national plan, the successor plan that we're working on now, is ready to go as soon as this plan finishes. But what we did in the budget with the $1.1 billion that we put towards women's safety predominantly over the next 2 years was to make sure that there was sufficient, or it was a down payment on the next plan, but also it was money to make sure that we had transitional funding so that no services, no supports, no programs would be left without the support and the funding and the resourcing that they needed as we put the next plan together, which, as I said, needs to be a really ambitious plan if we really are going to make the difference that we say we want to.
You've agreed to develop a specific plan to address violence against Indigenous women after criticism from Aboriginal leaders that the current plan does not work. What has been learnt from this summit about how best to ensure safety for women in this community, and will you commit to actually investing properly in trying to address this specific kind of violence?
Look, it was fantastic to listen to the Indigenous panel yesterday morning and the really powerful messages that came from that panel. I spoke to a number of the panel members yesterday afternoon about how we could address their specific issues. But in my time as Social Services Minister, I've travelled around Australia and gone to many Indigenous communities, and visiting a place like Arakoon, where the Family Responsibilities Commission actually does a lot of the work around justice and enforcement, I was privileged enough to actually sit in on a commission hearing and watching Indigenous women make decisions around what behaviour change that they wanted to see in their community was one of the most powerful experiences that I've ever seen. So I am really delighted to have the opportunity to work with people like June Oscar and Marsha Langdon and Sandra Creamer and many other Indigenous women around Australia, because they really clearly have a great understanding about what is best for their women and children.
So what progress has been made on the idea of a separate and very specific plan? Will you do that?
Well, in talking to the panel members yesterday afternoon, we're very keen to progress a separate plan that allows us to actually define real and practical solutions so that we can get things out on the ground, the kind of actions that they were asking for. So I'm very keen to look to make sure that we've got an action plan that is absolutely targeted at the kinds of actions, behaviours and programs that they want to see for their people.
1 in 10 children will experience abuse before the age of 18. The Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, has criticised the decision to leave children out of the summit, saying it's a gross oversight. Was it?
Well, look, not at all, Patricia. I mean, currently we are also consulting around the national plan for protecting Australia's children, and the Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollands, has undertaken approximately 300 interviews with children who have been the subject of abuse. But obviously, because of the really particular sensitivities around dealing with children who have been in these extraordinarily awful circumstances, we have been relying on the expertise and the trauma-informed understanding of somebody like Anne Hollands to undertake these consultations, and those consultations will feed in to this plan. But we were particularly conscious of making sure that the way we undertook those consultations was age appropriate.
Ms Tame has also criticised the appointment of Lorraine Finlay as the new Human Rights Commissioner, citing her opposition to affirmative consent and support of her twice convicted abuser. Was her appointment a grave mistake?
Well, look, I suppose I would like to say, first of all, I think that the Prime Minister's comments yesterday and were very, very clear about this government's absolute desire and understanding that laws around Australia can be improved, and that we have to make sure that we all work together, particularly states and territories who many of these laws sit with, to make sure that our laws are much more victim-centric. And so I think the federal government has a role to play in leadership around working with the states and territories so that we can get some consistency around laws, particularly as they relate to things like consent, to which you're referring, so that we can make sure that victims are actually receiving the kind of response that is going to support them in their decision to actually come forward.
But Minister, Lorraine Finlay, was she the right appointment? Do you think, given Grace Tame's comments, was she the right appointment?
Well, my understanding, Patricia, is the comments were relating to a technical interview that was undertaken by Ms Finlay some years ago in relation to a specific legal matter in relation to consent. I don't necessarily understand or believe that she was talking more generally about the issue of making sure that people have the right to actually have strong consent laws to support them, to make sure that they are supported in the decisions that they make.
Do you know if the government asked her those questions before her appointment?
Well, I certainly, as I say, I certainly understand. I mean, I've spoken to Ms Finlay myself, that she has been somebody who has been a great supporter and an advocate for supporting women and making sure that women who are victims of abuse and violence are supported through the court system. And my understanding is that she is a strong supporter of very strong consent laws.
Okay, just finally on COVID and these exemptions, the Prime Minister's weekend trip to visit family in Sydney cost taxpayers $6,000. No one would criticise him for wanting to spend time with his family. Everyone wants to spend time with their family. But this was not a work trip. Was this an acceptable use of taxpayer money? And do you understand people's frustration? They want to see their families too. There are border issues, and yet he seems to have got a special deal.
Well, I think the one thing I'd say is that the Prime Minister has been where he needed to be to undertake his duties whenever he needed to. I mean, yesterday morning he was here in Canberra to deliver the opening address to the summit, which he believed, as I think all Australians believe, was a very important thing to do. And I think, it seems like a bit of a cheap swipe at him. I mean, we've all been here for a long time. I'm not saying for a minute that a lot of Australians aren't doing it tough at the moment, but some of the cheap points that are being scored on this particular issue by the opposition, when the government has been in Canberra, just about every minister's been here for the last 5 weeks, and we're getting some, cheap tricks being thrown at us by the other side.
But why should the Prime Minister be able to visit family when the rest of us can't?
Well, I mean, obviously, I would like to see every father spend
But they can't, is the
his
point.
children. And that's why we have to do what we have to do in terms of getting vaccine rollouts so that we can get these lockdowns lifted so Australia can go back to being the country it needs to be.
Anne Ruston, thanks for joining me.